So, real quick, I want to ask you guys a question. How many of you are familiar with the New York Times? And, you know, you can let me know in the comment section below. I appreciate the comment engagement. You're amazing. Thank you very much. You do everything that I need to survive on the internet. Thank you. So, if you've heard of the New York Times, if you know about the New York Times, and you happen to be a frequent viewer of my channel, then you probably know that the New York Times, despite ostensibly being a somewhat liberal outlet, it tends to have a lot of weird op-ed pieces about trans people and how bad they are, which is weird, right? Like, that's a strange thing for a more liberal outlet to be doing. So, there's plenty of people who have accused the New York Times of exhibiting an anti-trans editorial bias, who've said that its coverage is often either inaccurate or harmful, or that it's skewed towards questioning transgender care instead of, you know, providing neutral fact-based information, which you can do by just looking up a study and getting the conclusion. I had an argument about puberty blockers in my comment section the other day, where somebody said that puberty blockers should not be used for a certain amount of time, and I respect where they're coming from because they were using research for their position as well. And my only response was, okay, cool, here's what Mayo Clinic says on it, and they say several years is safe. So I'm going to go by that, not my area of expertise. I'm going to just throw an expert at somebody else, as long as I can verify that they know what they're doing, which is not actually the appeal to authority fallacy, just in case somebody wants to interject with that one. The appeal to authority fallacy is when you say either that something is true because an expert said it, or you appeal to somebody who's not actually an authority on the issue. As an example, if I were to point to, say, you know, Blair White or Buck Angel and say that they were experts on the issue. Well, they're not. They just happen to be prolific. So, now that we got that bit out of the way, a New York Times shareholder and a mother of a kid who is trans, apparently confronted the publisher of the New York Times at the shareholder meeting over their years of long bias reporting on trans people. And Sulzberger, the person that they were confronting, was unrepentant and doubled down. And those are not my words. Those are the words of Alejandra Caraballo, who provided this over on Blue Sky. So we're going to go ahead and piggyback off of their work and take a listen.
We have a question from Brooke Williams, and the question reads, the annual report says the Times news product is core to revenue growth, yet you've reported a loss of about 2 million news-only subscribers over the last few years. Part of that loss is directly attributable to the Times reporting on transgender people, which has been cited by the Trump administration and others to justify discrimination and harm. This reporting is deeply concerning to me as the mom of a trans teen. What steps are you taking to be accountable to concerns of the trans community, readers, and shareholders?
So, pretty standard question, right? Hey, you're losing money over this bullshit, and that is what you should care about as a shareholder, so you attack it from that angle. You're losing money over this bullshit, and the Trump admin is saying that it is okay for them to harass trans people because even the New York Times agrees with their bigoted opinions. Neat. Excellent. A good angle of attack. Let's see what's said about that.
AGL, handless questions.
Great. Thank you, Brooke. First, I want to make a correction. We actually have more news subscribers than at any point in our history, and that number continued to grow robustly last year. That said, I really do appreciate hearing your perspective. Our editors and reporters covering these issues and overseeing coverage of these issues have actually spent a lot of time exploring concerns like this and meeting with those who have shared them.
Right. So I want you to understand what corporate nothing words are, because this is a grouping of them. So, a corporate nothing word, or a set of corporate nothing words, are words that are said by somebody in a corporation or any position of leadership that are meant not to contextualize a situation or to alleviate real concerns on a situation. They are things meant to diffuse a situation. So when you say, actually, our people have talked a lot with the people who are affected by this, and they know what they are doing. They have said lots of words with other people. Okay, cool. That can all be true, and you still have a propensity to engage in that biased reporting. That's a really, really easy thing to prove. So you can say, yeah, it's like the company doing the internal review, saying we did an internal review of ourselves and found that we were not complicit in fraud. It's the same thing. It is a set of phrases that is used not to inform you, not to contextualize things, but simply to diffuse you as if you were a bomb. Jassa says, I have to defend New York Times a little bit here. Very little bit. The fact checkers of Media Bias Fact Check say the news is very accurate, but the anti-trans and right-wing bigotry comes from their op-eds. There is an argument where they shouldn't platform these op-eds, but their news sections are accurate. Right. That's why I said earlier in the video that it was a series of op-eds that have been criticized by people in the trans community. Now, before we continue with that, there is an article from GLAAD about this, and I don't want to consent to cookies, fuck off. Said you can talk a lot and have a discussion while you hang somebody. It doesn't undo the hanging. Exactly. Like, you can say, oh, we talked a lot, we got this information out there, but it doesn't mean anything truly. But, okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this and see what can be said here. The New York Times coverage of transgender people and issues has been critiqued for years by trans people, the broader LGBTQ community, and allies. Now, instead of directly addressing the critiques, meeting with the community harmed by the coverage, or forthrightly fixing its errors in reporting and news gathering, the Times is deploying its most distrusted and discredited reporters in a new project designed to profit off of its inaccurate and biased coverage. The project is a multi-episode podcast on transgender healthcare that was repeatedly shopped around by the Times sales office with sponsorship opportunities in the tens of thousands of dollars. The podcast promos say the episodes will explore the political fight around essential healthcare for transgender people. The promos did not say if the Times would acknowledge how the Times coverage fueled that political fight, or how its stories are repeatedly cited to justify harmful policies and legislations that criminalize the care and ban access to it. Transgender contributors from the New York Times and advocacy groups have tried for years to get the Times to listen to the community it is covering and harming, to hire trans people on its staff to stop its inaccurate, biased reporting. The Times continues to perpetuate the same mistakes and the same harm. Says reporters have betrayed the trust of LGBTQ families who regret speaking with the Times. Oh, that's so weird. So you as the shareholder can say, oh, yeah, no, we talked with the families. Yeah, but then those families are saying that you betrayed them. There's a link here. Let's see what that mentions. A story on the allegations of a former St. Louis gender clinic staffer, Jamie Reed, left parents who spoke with the New York Times reporter, Azine Goriashi. Interesting. So you've got a whole fucking article here about somebody who spoke with the New York Times and then felt like their reporting on the issue was a betrayal of them. Interesting. Almost like I was fucking right. And when you say, oh no, we talked with the people that you say are affected. Yeah, you can talk with them while hurting them. That ain't hard. That ain't hard to do. Sean says, why is it that they must always do podcasts? So I can speak on that a little bit. Podcasts are the best form of second screen material that one can have, because they are an usually almost entirely auditory experience. This means that in terms of engagement, unlike something like a made-for-TV program that needs you to be sitting down paying attention to it, a podcast can be played in your ear while you're at the gym, at work, on a forklift, on a tractor, in the car, anything. And because long form content, there's two kinds of content that are king: short form attention grabbing content and long form background content. Because long form background content is king in the advertising space, podcasts are the number one best, most distilled version of what every corporation wants second screen material to facilitate. An outlet for advertisers to piggyback off of that can be played in the background of anything you are doing. That said, I have a podcast coming up where I will be speaking with multiple content creators who are progressive voices, because I think that the left has a media scaling problem. We keep trying to do this Joe Rogan to the left bullshit, and it's never going to work. Instead, working on what we do well with, having a lot of content creators speaking their minds together is always going to work better. And trying to speak about non-political things is always going to yield decent results there as well, because that's what the right uses. The technique the right has been using for years is having an apolitical podcast that inadvertently starts splicing its podcasts in and then saying, that's not a political opinion, that's just fact. So, I'm going to be doing the same thing. The podcast title is The Third Space Arcade, and the very first episode is actually going to be about Resident Evil, and it's featuring Claire, also known as Proton John, and it is featuring Anthony Gramila. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly this time, because I pronounced it incorrectly in the podcast. Got corrected on the podcast, and then promptly forgot how to pronounce his last name, because I am a terrible friend. That said, so that is why I am following that one. Yep, that is why you are following that one. That is me. That is a channel that I am working on right now. The first episode is recorded. Said, Gramalia. Yeah, but the G is silent. It's Gramalia. It's Gramalia. There we go. I remember it now. I had to remember how it was spelt in order to get it right. We had a joke on the podcast that the name was Italian, and I said, oh, so it's a fake name you took because of the mafia disbanding, and he's like, actually, historically, that's a thing that happened. And I was like, oh, shit, I pulled that out of my ass. I didn't know that happened. Weird. So back to what we were talking about. Yeah, we'll get to that. But yeah, the podcast is king in terms of long-form background content at what it does. So everybody is doing one. It's also the lowest effort thing you possibly can make, which is why mine is not low effort. I don't know how to do things without, like, a setup OBS screen. So look forward to that, I guess. It said, the Mafia disbanded? What? So the... Not completely, but as we started cracking down on mafias, Italian mafias, there were ones who had last names that were associated with the family so hard that they took on new identities with new names in order to avoid backlash in future. So Jessica Davis says, oh, you're serious? Yeah, that was a thing that happened, apparently. I was unaware of this. Anthony let me know on the podcast. So if you want that conversation, that is going to be on that podcast from Third Space Arcade. Anyway, the Times continues to recycle its inaccurate and biased reporting to support preconceived notions and its fully misguided commitment to inaccurate both sides journalism. Both sides journalism, my favorite. The kind of journalism where you can say, man, one side wants this group genocided and the other side wants to not die. We should probably report both sides of this. We should give you the full picture. Like, I feel like maybe the full picture is the people getting the genocide happening to them. I think that's a pretty accurate picture, actually. I think it's a pretty decent one, personally. I don't think there's a common ground here between the two perspectives, honestly. A recent story managed to quote transgender legal experts and medical providers. Trans voices and stories about trans people are rare in the Times reporting, but was backfilled by several paragraphs of inaccurate previous reporting, including unchallenged anti-trans voices. Oh, so even when they had legal experts who are trans quoted in their stories, they're just like, yeah, no, but we gotta fluff it up with all kinds of Blair White shit. Okay. So we need to make these equal positions, dumbass journalists. Exactly. The Times coverage has been cited by multiple anti-LGBTQ politicians to justify legalizing discrimination and criminalizing support of transgender people, a fact the Times itself has never covered. Interesting. And, from them. New York Times' latest op-ed on trans kids has already been cited in an anti-trans legal brief. That was from February 9th, 2024. Wow, shortly after the Project 2025 stuff started, really being talked about a lot by people. Fantastic. I love it. Every single bit of it, great. Great. Wonderful. Said, when there is news of legitimate research and reports that support medical necessity, support medically necessary mainstream care and detail the benefits of it, the Times fails to cover it. The Times has covered Utah's legislative attacks against the trans community in more than half a dozen articles, but it did not cover Utah's legislature's study finding that transgender healthcare actually benefits trans youth. Yeah, that was a funny one where the Utah politicians who wanted to enact laws against trans people said, we need to fund a study to prove what we want, and then it proved that they were all fucking wrong. That was kind of funny. The Times leadership has repeatedly refused to acknowledge the harms and impacts of its reporting. Publisher A.Z. Sulzberger told shareholders in April that he believes that the reporting has been fair and respectful. If the trans people don't believe that, then I don't think it is. Like, okay, it's like saying that you were reporting very fair and respectfully on Gaza, but you didn't have any Palestinians talk about their personal experiences of being bombed. But it was fair and respectful. It was definitely fair and respectful. Or, you know, you have those experiences in there, you have those conversations in there, but you bury them under like 3 or 4 paragraphs of IDF propaganda. Garnier says, so they went not enough data despite their own people they funded went over everything and took like 2 years. Exactly. Exactly. But let's go ahead and continue on with the doubling down.
And, you know, I believe it have concluded that our coverage has indeed been fair and comprehensive.
Hold on.
Of time exploring concerns like this and meeting with those who have shared them. And, you know, I believe it have concluded that our coverage has indeed been fair and comprehensive.
So the subtitles say they have concluded, which means that the trans people they talked about that said that they were betrayed by the New York Times concluded they were fair and respectful, which seems like that's not what they actually concluded. But I don't know if I can believe the subtitles, because the subtitles could be inaccurate, and if they are, then the other word would be we concluded. So again, in one scenario, it's, you know, lying, or it doesn't have to be lying. It can be a mistruth from deliberate omission of data. So, like, let's say you have the New York Times covers trans people disparagingly. There's 20 articles that do it, and you talk to a bunch of people in those articles, and everybody who you talked to in the articles say that they felt that things were not fair and were very anti-trans, except for 2 of them, but the 2 trans people are fucking Blair White and Buck Angel. Like, yeah, at that point, I'm gonna tilt my head a little bit and go, it's not an incorrect statement that people you've talked to that are trans, that have been interviewed, say that your reporting was fair and unbiased, but, like, it's not an accurate statement, all things considered. RKS, thank you for the follow.
And that's an opinion I share. It's been incredibly rigorously reported and edited, and I think really respectful of the people we're covering and sensitive to the moment. There are few issues in society that are evolving as quickly as questions around gender identity, and our role is...
Can we just say that, no, the questions aren't evolving quickly there, actually. The conversation on the internet alone is well over a decade old. All you have to do is look into the past of the fucking anti-SJW movement, and you're going to find shit as early as 2014. I'm sorry, but I think that 10 years minimum is not rapid changing. That sounds like a long-ass fucking time, personally. I would think rapid being like a year or 2, but that's not the case here. Not really. Not to mention, like, the article that, or not article, but the study, the qualitative study that I've used before for the societal impacts and societal application of gender is one from JSTOR, which is Doing Gender, and that study was done in 1984 or 88. I don't remember the exact date, but it was in the 80s. Like, I'm sorry, but this is not a new and rapidly evolving conversation. It's been the same conversation for quite a bit. Now, there is one aspect of the conversation that has changed a little bit, and that is how we use the terms transgender and transsexual, and how the term hermaphrodite has died in order to make way for the term intersex, because it is infinitely more accurate. Those are, speaking in broad terms of decades, more recent conversations that the trans community has had amongst itself. And that's entirely understandable. But generally speaking, in terms of the medical information we have outside of, like, medical advancements and surgeries, I don't think things have changed all that much. Sea Snake says intersex feels less like I'm being spat at. Yeah, and that's entirely fair. It said about 40 years ago is a long time. Exactly. Now, granted, there is, to give them credit, like with the conversation about if you have a handful of trans people who say it's fair and unbiased, but there's 20 others who aren't saying that, it could be the New York Times looking specifically at those two conversations that I mentioned and using them as the basis to say that, oh, well, this has been rapidly changing. Because if you listen to like an old queer, if you listen to somebody from that era, so like somebody who's 50 or 60 who is trans, they will tell you that the term that they used to describe themselves 30 or 40 years ago was transsexual, because they talked more in terms of the transition from one to another. They talked more in terms of the medical part of the process. The transgender word is a little newer by comparison, but it is a word that encompasses more people and is therefore more useful, because a trans person does not start being a trans person the minute that they start taking HRT or the minute that they start going under a surgery. A trans person starts being a trans person the minute they don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Stego says, will we use terms used for plants and flowers to describe different orientations? Example, perfect flowers or dioecious. Sea Snake says, it was the only term. Yeah, it was the term that was used then. We have more words. There's another aspect of this that has to be considered, is that in the last 10 years, and maybe this is where I'm snapshotting. Maybe this is why I'm snapshotting that way. But in the last 10 years, the conversation where trans people is concerned has been able to be a lot more consistent, because things like Twitter have allowed the trans community to have an actual community voice. Something that did not exist in like the 2008 internet to the same degree that we have now. Social media was in its infancy. MySpace was relevant back then. Said Mook says, it's important to bear in mind that language is descriptive, not prescriptive. Exactly. There's certain idiots on the internet that believe that language prescribes things, and they are disagreed with by everybody who writes dictionaries. So,
to cover all aspects of that shift fully and fairly, we've reported hundreds of stories totaling hundreds of thousands of words that look at prejudice and the attacks that this vulnerable community is facing. We've also covered groundbreakers in the community and the hopes and struggles for trans rights. And I don't think you could read any of that and think that the New York Times is anti-trans.
So the argument is not that the New York Times is anti-trans. The argument is that the New York Times inadvertently, through its reporting of trans issues inaccurately, is causing harm. Very different. Being the person who enables somebody to be anti-trans and feel like they're being more accurate in doing so is not the same thing as being anti-trans yourself, but it's adjacent enough to be a problem. So transphobia is just so stupid, man. I understand that perspective. And I very, very much agree with it, but I want to throw another perspective at you real quick to maybe understand where some of them are coming from. Because, like, obviously, there are some transphobes who come from their position because they want to be edgy on the internet, or they want to be hateful, or what have you. Like, those exist, right? To pretend that there's zero people on the internet who don't do things just to be cruel and hateful is silly. But there are enough people who are inadvertently transphobes, like actually transphobic, because they do not understand anything about the topic. And there are plenty of responses that human beings can take to things they don't understand, but one of our most powerful responses is fear. That is a very standard response for people who feel like they don't understand something at all, to just be afraid of it. And I'm not saying that transphobia always means afraid, but there are people who respond that way in fear. Either they're afraid of questioning their own gender identity, or they're afraid of a world where their partner or their child might question their gender identity. Like, there's plenty of scenarios where the person is transphobic but can be led to water, and we need to be able to understand how they come to those conclusions if we are to change their minds. We can't change their minds by simply pointing at them and calling them stupid. even though, you know, a lot of them in today's day and age with access to full information on the internet are in fact stupid. Like, that isn't to say that the stupid ones don't exist. Tired says fear is no excuse for ignorance. I disagree. I think fear is a valid excuse for ignorance, and the way to solve that problem is to educate. I think fear is a completely valid feeling. I think it makes perfect sense. It's a very human emotion. And to dismiss that, we dismiss one of our tools for educating people. Again, there are people who we should look at and laugh and mock. The Matt Walshes and Ben Shapiros of the world are those people. But there are other people who we should try to lead to water.
And I should mention as well that our editorial page has explicitly championed trans rights for many years and continues to do so today. So again, I appreciate the question and can assure you that our reporters and editors are going to continue to work to make sure that this journalism meets the highest standards.
So that may be true of the New York Times main pieces. That may be true of those, of their accuracy, but it doesn't seem to be true of their op-eds. Fennec says, feelings are valid, how you act might not be. You can be afraid and not be a dick. Again, understandable. But I can also see, especially like if you're a parent, I can see the perspective of that person thinking that they're trying to protect their kid. And if you're not able to meet that person where they are, you can't change their mind. And you being correct and them being wrong is a useless standard for progress. You being correct and then being able to move people to a position of being correct as well is a better standard for progress. She says, don't worry, after that, by like a year or so, he changed to you or brain. Oh, that's a different conversation. Ansel says, I think it's more ignorance that causes fear. It can be both. It can be both. So you can be ignorant of something and therefore be afraid of it, or you can be afraid of it and therefore never educate yourself on it and gain ignorance from that. It's the cart and the horse look nightmarishly similar here. And so it's always a good idea to sit down with the person and have a conversation like, okay, cool. I understand you feel that way. May I ask why? That's all you have to do. It's the smallest thing. And I understand if you're trans, you may not want to do that because that can be a very, very dangerous thing depending on who you do that with. But there are plenty of people who, when you sit down and talk with them and go, hey, I understand you feel that way, but I want to meet you where you're at. Why do you feel that way? Why do you feel the way you do about trans people? Why is that a thing that you are concerned about to such a heavy degree? Fennec says, I mean, also, fear about something valid can make you do and believe some wild stuff. Yup, is true. Sea Snake says, some people look for any excuse they can to not accept something because it's different and they don't like it. Again, also true. Tired says, my issue is we live in the age of information. There's no excuse to be ignorant when the world is at our literal fingertips. That is a perspective that I can respect. Allow me to offer a counter. Nobody is well-trained enough, I think, like in the normal, like standard spaces of the internet. I don't think people are well-trained enough to know what an expert looks or sounds like. Most people do not know how to assemble a bibliography. Most people do not know how to check citations on a study. Most people do not know how to check amount of citations and where they are being cited to see if it is refutations or not. And most people cannot tell the difference between somebody who speaks with confidence on a subject and somebody who speaks with expertise on a subject. Most people are not informed on that. So all it takes is somebody saying that they understand the situation well, that they've read into it, that they are super well versed in it, and that could be enough for you to agree with them because, again, most people are not trained in how to do that. Yes, we have the internet at our fingertips. Yes, people have access to all the information in the world. It's the easiest thing in the world. But, and yes, Jessica, I've read it the 3 times you said it, the FDR quote, only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I have read it every time. I just didn't say it each time. I can see the chat. But when you are at your workplace and somebody says that they don't understand a topic and you suggest them somebody, you're almost always going to suggest a YouTuber or a Twitch streamer. You're going to suggest somebody who is a micro celebrity. And none of those people are experts, generally speaking. Like, there are some people who have expertise and therefore make YouTube videos. The Hank Greens and the Forrest Alkis of the world do exist. But the person you're likely going to recommend is almost always going to be some kind of influencer to tell them about certain things. Because it's a language we all speak. We all speak the language of turning on YouTube and finding something to watch. That is a universal human experience now, so long as you have a smartphone. And you will almost never be able to get somebody to read a study. You will almost never be able to hand somebody a study and go, well, here's why. I tried that with a friend of mine years ago, and that friend is no longer a friend because they went on a bigoted rampage while we were trying to do magic with our D&D group. I've told that story a handful of times. But anytime that I gave an opinion on something, if they questioned it, I would say, I understand you feeling the way you do about this. Here is a study so that you can read it to support what I'm saying. Because I am not trying to hip fire or speak bullshit. I have no evidence that they did or did not read any of those studies. But I have a pretty good hunch they never read any of them. But they did watch a lot of Ben Shapiro. A lot of Ben Shapiro. In fact, probably an unhealthy amount of Ben Shapiro. So, it's also where the New York Times stuff comes in. Because when you're giving somebody something to read, a research paper is going to be hard and dense and difficult for most people. But a, 15-paragraph news source is going to be easier for them to read through. That's what they're built for. News is made to be hyper-digestible. That is what journalists are paid to do, is make digestible content that can go up onto their channels, onto their publications. And when you get more op-eds coming from a, quote, reputable source like the New York Times, then you're going to get that pushback from people who look at what they're doing, look at what they're reporting, and then say, actually, no, as a shareholder, I don't feel comfortable with you saying these things. I want to look at the comments here. Will Sharp says, hey, look at this pink cat girl. He'll learn you good. Exactly. Like, I don't look or sound like an expert on the internet. I look and sound like a fucking VTuber. But there are people who can't tell the difference. Interesting. Okay, so the New York Times is a MAGA rag at this point. This is the most blue sky thing I could see said on the internet. They're not a MAGA rag. They are a liberal publication, which is not the same thing. Nico Marcus saying, this is so disingenuous and gross, I feel dirty having listened to it. Again, it sounded like corporate deflection. I agree with that. He got really close to saying the trans question there. I'm convinced they're all pedophiles. His grandfather's FBI file was destroyed months before his death. I'm becoming a conspiracy theorist, but it's because the rich and powerful were all raping kids and supporting each other. Hey, that one I agree with. If somebody's a billionaire, I automatically scrutinize them now as like an Epstein affiliate. Said I don't read the New York Times because of paid walls. Yeah, that too. While Sulzberger really is low-key radicalized on a deep personal level by right-wing anti-trans garbage to such a degree that oppositional defiant disorder instantly kicks in when he's confronted. That's worse than I imagined, which is saying something. I don't know if I took the same read as this person did. It sounded like basic-ass corporate deflection. Nothing speech. Maybe I'm just used to seeing this shit a lot in like the games industry when they talk about cutbacks and scalebacks and shit like that I'm used to seeing those words. But said, yes, he wants to ruin trans lives. Nobody should read that paper. I don't think that that's what's happening there. I think that they just do not give a shit what their op-ed does. Again, there's a difference between the transphobe and the person who enables the transphobe. They are very adjacent and it should never be forgotten that they are, but still. Margo says, I can kind of at least see where they're coming from with the level of sane washing, but that also applies to a paper that's liberal derogatory. Right, like that's the thing. Sane washing is a very liberal thing to do. Thank you for the follow, Miss Dusty. I appreciate it. But yeah, I wanted to cover that because I know that the New York Times has been getting a lot of shit, and deservedly so, for its coverage on trans people, and seeing the way that one of the higher level people within the org uses deflection to try to defend the harm that they are doing is a bit wild to me, and I thought it was probably worth covering. Hey, you made it to the end. I want to give an extra thanks to the patrons who allow me to do this full time. I want to thank Aaron Rail, Astral, Britzkrieg, Jemshin, Poundini, Red Joker, Victoria, Jonas, Craig, Tarika, Fireshard, Smiling GM, John, Dren Hadamada, Creeper, Sagitta, you know I'm not saying that last part, Sylvie Snow, Valis of Seraph, Ottoman Angel, Rooster Rachel, and Fire Panda, who are all my $20 and up patrons.